interest. It basically collects together some particular thoughts of my own and perspective on the subject of ghost hunting. I've called it Ghost Hunting, Testimony and Evidence Back to the Future. And the origins of this talk really are multifold, but they go back several years to discussions I had with Steve Parsons and James Tachi in the Ghost Club and the Society for Psychical Research about the field generally, about the need for all investigators of the paranormal to become more scientific in their approach and to have a better understanding of methodology, of laboratory and experimental techniques, and particularly for those sort of ghost hunters who like deploying equipment, the importance of understanding the equipment and being able to take accurately, scientifically sound measurements. Now, these are subjects which certainly Steve Parsons, James Tachi and a number of other people have emphasised, and indeed, although ghost hunters often call themselves scientific, it must be said that there is a lot to be desired about the approaches being taken by some practitioners in the field, to put it mildly. Another source of inspiration was looking into a book written by a skeptic, the editor at the time of a Skeptical Inquirer magazine, when he looked at the whole question of ghosts and ghost hunting in the United States. And as you might expect, his book was critical, but he basically made a point which I found it a little hard to disagree with, his fundamental point. What he was saying, in essence, is that despite best part of a century's effort in trying to record scientific evidence for ghosts, we haven't really got any. And I have to say that as skeptical books go, they tend to be a bit of an acquired taste, often a bad one. But I think he had actually made quite a valid point as regards equipment-based ghost hunting, which is what great many groups, great many individuals aspire to do. But in terms of actually discovering evidence that would prove a ghost scientifically, it's been a pretty poor record, not over just the last generation, but several generations. Of course, crucial that we actually decide what we mean by a ghost. Now, he was looking at it very much from, as many people do, as evidence of unquiet spirits, of possibly of some kind of survival after death. The typical Oxford English Dictionary definition of a ghost is, a presence which appears after somebody's died, which appears to be the personality or the spirit of the person. That's the common assumption, the assumption of many people who are into the subject. Some people might even say that that's what we're all trying to do, is desperately try and prove that we are surviving in some form, even as ghosts, as formal religious observance has declined, that maybe scientific ghost hunting is a post-Enlightenment attempt to face up to the fact that we might not have a future after death, and that if material science is correct, then we have our 70 years and 10, and maybe a modest bonus, but that really is it in terms of consciousness. And a great many of people around the world take that kind of view, at least in the Western world, so far as they think about these questions more deeply, whereas it could be said that organisations such as ASSAP and other investigators still cherish or hope for the idea of some kind of survival or immortality, but we are a bit stuck when it comes to scientific evidence for this. And I have to say, I think when it comes to the use of equipment, and it can be very simple, it can be very complicated, as to trying to prove the existence of ghosts in that sense. I have to say there is very little evidence, to my mind, that would suggest a theory or a hypothesis even of survival after death. And that, in fact, has been the view of a great many ghost hunters I know over many years. Names of some of them, when you actually look what they've said in very interesting books they've published over many years. I'm thinking here, for example, of Peter Underwood, who, after 60 odd years of chasing ghosts, said that he'd never really come across anything that personally convinced him 100% that there was survival after death. He'd witnessed strange things, had strange observations. Similar view was taken again by the late Tony Cornell, who was an active ghost hunter from the late 1940s through up until his death in 2010. And he wrote a book, 2002, published by the Parapsychology Foundation, saying, well, I've seen many odd things, strange things, things that convince me that there's real phenomena, but nothing that really personally convinced me of survival after death. And overall, the evidence seemed to be fairly poor in terms of what we typically call ghosts, or things inhabiting haunted houses, in terms of what we can obtain in terms of recording equipment. We haven't really got very much to show at all. And he also extended that view as well to many years of attending seances and so forth. And it's and it would give a third example I knew very well, was the late Andrew Greene, who to a large extent was the man who really promoted and invented modern scientific ghost hunting in Britain. He published the first popular book on the subject, Ghost Hunting: A Practical Guide, in 1973. I brought out a posthumous updated edition in 2016. It's a pioneering work, the first of its type. Andrew himself was, he often said it, a ghost hunter who did not believe in ghosts. Andrew accepted the reality of psi phenomena, of telepathy, of psychokinesis, of powers such as dowsing. But if he didn't actually think there was survival, he more or less attributed everything to the subconscious mind, and took the view that it's a product of consciousness and something possibly electromagnetic in nature, which lingers after death. If we put the question more widely, I think we have got some evidence of strange things going on in haunted houses. If we were to put the question more widely, and we said, for example, how would we define a ghost? Somebody asked me, how would you define a ghost? I would say, for paranormal investigation terms, I would talk about psi effects, things we can't really understand or explain properly, which appear to persist after the death of an individual. There is, I think, some evidence which, or at least suggestive of something strange going on in what premises that we call haunted. It seems that over many, many years, and this we can't dispute, many people have experienced what we call apparitions. There is some evidence, I would say, that certainly a lot of suggestive popular evidence that other animals, cats, dogs, the higher mammals, may also have some sensitivity or receptivity to phenomena which we as human beings have been calling ghosts. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence collected over many years that cats, dogs, horses, the higher mammals at least, can respond to something which we also identify as a ghost or a haunting or some kind of phenomena. So, you know, we have got anomalies for sure. Hence, you know, ASSAP has a good title in the sense, anomalous phenomena. But what that actually is, well, that's the interesting question. If I look, this made me think about my own experience. I mean, the one apparition I believe I have seen. And this was in January 2011, 23rd January 2011. And cut a long story short, I was up quite early that morning. I was in the process of helping nurse my late father, who was very ill, and from time to time he needed help and attention during the night. I got up to help him out about 5 o'clock in the morning, and then I went back to bed. And suddenly, as I lay back trying to get back to sleep, there I wasn't on my way into sleep. I don't think it was hypnagogic in that sense, but I suddenly had a very strong sensation of a presence, and also I knew who it was. And at the end of the bed, typically where a lot of people over the years have seen an apparition standing by the bedside, or they see their apparition when they're in bed, there was a form. Now, as this was a January morning, around about 5 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't see a great deal. It was dark. I could see a profile, an outline which I felt I recognised. I could see a form in the darkness, it could be said, which was human shaped, and I also knew at the same time instinctively who it was, and it was a French lady with whom I'd had a relationship about 13 years earlier. I hadn't actually, our relationship actually ended on very good terms about 2000. I'd seen her off and on occasion. I hadn't actually seen her face to face for about 5 years. We'd occasionally meet up for lunch or something like that. I actually believed at the time she was in France. I'd heard that she was ill, but as far as I knew she was in France. I tended to find out more about her through mutual friends abroad. Anyway, there at the end of the bed, there was a figure, and I wasn't at all frightened by it. It was more, I would say, a feeling of being troubled in terms of suffering a very strong feeling of depression and sadness. Now, and that was perhaps the most profound part of the experience, not just the visual side. And I lay there for about 30 seconds and then realized that, you know, I had to try and do something. So mistake I made, I realize, is I then reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on, and as the room illuminated, my eyes adjusted, the form seemed to vanish away. And at the end of it, I was still left, however, not frightened, not scared, but with this profound feeling of sadness and depression, which stayed with me well into the morning. And at that point, well, knowing my psychical research, at that point I did actually make a very quick written note in a bedside diary I kept, usually for writing down dreams, or, you know, those brilliant thoughts that come to you in the early hours of the morning, which, unless you do make the trouble to record them, may well prove fly forgotten as a dream at the break of day. So I know, and quite often I was undergoing broken evenings or broken nights helping out look after my dad. So it was just something I did. So I wrote it down there, but that's where I was rather limited. Thereafter, I believed she was abroad. didn't know really where to take it. So I just wrote it down, and it was a strange figure, my one and only visual apparition, certainly in terms of any recognised experience. Anyway, to cut the story down, you can probably guess the rest if you know of course, the classic Phantasms of the Living, 1886 by Myers, Podmore and Gurney. Their two-volume monumental collection of crisis apparitions. 2 weeks later, I learnt from mutual friends abroad that this lady had actually died. She'd actually died on that day, and she died, in fact, in the Charing Cross Hospital in London, which I did not know. I didn't have the heart to do it myself, but a friend who is a genealogist kindly applied for the certificate of death, and it confirms she did actually die on that day. Death is certified on that day. Doesn't give a time or whatever, but it coincides with the entry in my own little journal. And I've subsequently published that as an account, which appeared in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in 2013. Now, in itself, there is nothing unusual about that story. There are hundreds of cases like that collected since the 1880s. In fact, they exist in literature much earlier. They appear to be rarer today. Now, there can be all kinds of ideas about that or why. It may well be that patterns of death certainly have altered considerably since the 19th century, and close analysis of the classic cases collected in the 19th century, and there's 2 surveys, the 1886 survey and the 1890 Census of Hallucinations, which involved a questionnaire that went out to 17,000 people. These remain 2 of the biggest studies of popular public hallucinations ever undertaken in all the years since. Nobody in psychology has attempted anything on quite that scale, but there was 702 cases they felt were worth publishing. Mine would fit into that classic model. That is somebody who has an experience of seeing a figure or a form which is not physically there, which they recognize, or maybe having some other kind of experience, maybe they hear something, or a very strong sensation, or even sometimes an object movement may occur at the point of death. Now, these things do go on, there's no doubt about it. I had this experience. Would, however, deploying any equipment at the time have recorded anything? And on that, I have significant doubt. Even if I'd had a camera by the bedside, or I was, whatever reason, one can conceive of having filming equipment in one's own bedroom. If I deployed a video unit or something like that, would anything have shown up? My own feeling is probably no. Our own the evidence for photographic evidence for ghosts, I'm afraid, is really quite poor. When you talk to somebody who's seen an apparition, I've noticed that there's a significant difference with the way they talk about it compared with people who come to you simply with strange or anomalous photographs. The person who's seen a ghost just tells you their story. They know what they have seen, and they can describe in whatever the limits of their language or description or vocabulary and memory may be, what they saw, like they could describing any other event which they've witnessed personally themselves. And they can give you a description. Sometimes the description is very clear, there's lots of information. lot of the time these days, certainly compared with some of the classic cases, we don't seem to have as many good reports of really detailed apparitions in terms of facial figures, in terms of clothing, wearing apparel, and so forth. A lot of ghosts, for some reason, the last 35 years or so, seem to be a lot more sort of shadowy and vague or cloudy. But saying that, we still do get interesting apparition reports. I talked to somebody 2017 who was in a pub in the New Forest, maintained he hadn't drunk too much, but went out into the yard, and he saw a figure of a woman in a dress he thought was a real person. Interestingly, he didn't see the face. Now, that's something you notice in a lot of apparition reports, certainly in the last generation, and even longer, going back into the 19th century. Quite often the facial features are absent from the description. It's almost as though the witness is able to process it, however they see it or experience it. They can process all the features of the figure. He could describe the hair color, he could describe the clothing, the build of this lady, and so forth, and the way she moved, and even approximate perhaps to her age, but he couldn't actually see her face. And you'll notice, and of course, there's the dreadful folkloric terror lore of faceless phantoms and faceless figures. It's something that just keeps showing up, which may tell us something about the nature of these experiences. But he could give a description of an apparition. But again, compare it then to the photographs. I think for most people's satisfaction, we have laid, thankfully, orbs to rest. But then think of all the other ghost photographs alleged which circulate. How few of them resemble anything at all, let alone a full-blown human figure. And this is where I've noticed the difference with people who come to you simply with the photograph. Typically, they did not see that photograph at the time they took the picture. It was a post-development or digitalization interpretation. There is some blob or blotch which could be anything in this world or the next, to quote Stainton Moses, a 19th century investigator and medium, certainly did believe in survival. This is quite incredible when you think about it. By 1875, in an article in a magazine called Human Nature, the Reverend Stainton Moses said he had seen over 600 alleged ghost or spirit photographs, of which he only thought about a dozen were even recognizable as something human. He said there are people who will recognize a sheet and a broom as a portrait of the dear departed, and the evidence there is just not really there. I mean, many of you will have seen the classic photograph reproduced endlessly since 1965, actually taken in 1936, of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, which is, at least it does look like ghostly, and it shows a glowing light in a form possibly like a veiled woman coming down a staircase. It was published on the 26th of December 1936 in Country Life magazine. It was taken by two Country Life photographers taking snaps of Raynham Hall, the Marquis of Townsend. Strangely enough, virtually everybody, there was so much going on in the 1930s, Borley Rectory, talking mongooses, the Loch Ness Monster, seances, Harry Price investigations, opening Joanna Southcott's box. It really was a lively time for psychical research and the paranormal. And curiously enough, the Raynham Hall photograph was ignored It was just one of the daily wonders of the press at the time, or certain sections of the press. And because there were other important things happening, like the situation in Russia and the rise of Hitler, and there were other things that sort of took away people's attention from ghost photographs taken in halls in Norfolk. But it was saved. A copy of it was saved. He went there at the time by the late Dennis Barnes, who was the man who started Panorama, who I was fortunate enough to know for a number of years. And Dennis published the photograph of the Brown Lady, which he acquired over nearly 30 years earlier, in his book Ghosts and Hauntings in 1965, which brought it back into circulation. And at least it does look like something, but the point is, whatever is behind it, and I am doubtful about this being a ghost photograph. Sad though it saddens me, it's such an iconic, wonderful photograph. I don't think myself the answer lies in it being a ghost, but I think there's other possibilities, possibly fraud, or possibly bad photography and double exposure. But the important thing is that picture does not resemble the detailed descriptions of the actual Brown Lady, an apparition that was seen for, as far as we can establish from the accounts, for the best part of 100 years prior to that. And if you look at drawings of the Brown Lady, it actually does look like a rather drawn old lady in a brown brocade dress. The witnesses could describe her clothing, they could describe her facial features, they could describe her general appearance, her eyes even, and it is nowhere near the description. These descriptions are nowhere near this particular picture, which is a glowing shape. And it's interesting, the Marquess of Townsend, who was a great believer in the paranormal, very religious woman, she didn't think the Brown Lady photograph was the ghost of the Brown Lady at all. She actually thinks, in the correspondence that survived, she told researchers she thought this was actually a photograph of the Virgin Mary, and the glowing figure is actually a Marian apparition. She was devout believer in Marian apparitions, and she thinks that it's a visitation from the Virgin Mary, not an apparition in the traditional human ghost sense at all. And I have to say that once you get rid of the Brown Lady photograph, you don't have very many photographs at all that actually look really like a human being. The deeper one looks into them, and one has to go back to the original photograph, one has to go back to the original witnesses and photographers and so forth, and look at all the circumstances. We can't really say we've got any decent ghost photographs. Now, for my view, I mean, going back to Stainton Moses in 1875, he was largely unconvinced of the ability of the camera to catch images of apparitions on film. So where does this leave us? I think we can basically say there's no doubt people do experience apparitions. I mean, leaving aside my own testimony, we can say that people clearly do see ghosts, and I shall just make a point at the end to say that probably there's a good chance you will also see a ghost yourself. Everyone listening to this has at least one good chance in their life to see a ghost. I'll just round that off at the end. Some of you may already have had an apparitional experience. What the evidence seems to suggest, if we look at lots of surveys and reports, is that if you see one ghost, you'll probably go on to see 2 or 3 in your lifetime. It's not just a one-off experience. Many people, when you actually talk to them, will actually recount multiple sightings. Now, if they're telling you about seeing a ghost practically every time they step out the door, they're One possibility is they are highly psychic. They're in fact to the point of being mediumistic. Or alternatively, one has to run through a checklist of 10 or 10 or 12 different possibilities. Simply because somebody says they see something, I know very well from the law, or claims that they've seen something, does not necessarily mean that they have seen anything paranormal, anything amounting to an apparition. Let's go through the quick checklist, shall we? Well, they may have simply, and I think this applies to a lot of outdoor sightings, and certainly any sightings at a distance, they may have misperceived natural stimuli. They may have made some kind of visual error and seen something which is a mirage, something which is just smoke, which could just be misperception of some naturally occurring thing, steam from a drain, even a piece of washing hanging from a washing line. A shirt with pockets has been mistaken as an apparition by a motorist speeding by. Story many years ago was about a property where a ghostly girl walked past the window, and motorists going by caught from the peripheral vision from the side, they saw a figure going past this window as they drove by. In fact, there was a mirror the other side, and they were actually seeing a reflection of themselves and their vehicle going by. So that's one explanation one needs to think of. Then, of course, there are people who really want to see a ghost very much, or alternatively are very, very fearful of seeing a ghost, and they hallucinate one. It's a case of autosuggestion. Then we have third category we have to watch out for from time to time, hoaxers, liars, people who claim they have seen the most remarkable things. And I usually divide them into three categories. There are the out-and-out diamond-studded hoaxers who are telling you lies right from the beginning and know that they're lying and just making the whole story up. One giveaway is usually, if they've got a really good story, they sometimes mention the issue of money quite early on. And then there are those who are, shall we say, negligent, who tend to exaggerate what they see. And then thirdly, and often the most difficult, are those who are innocent, who really do tell stories and genuinely seem to believe them. And there you may have to start to ask a few further questions. What further questions could you ask? Well, an important question is to find out, and you have to do this tactfully, is to find out if they're on any medication, if they are intoxicated or were at the time of the experience, or if they were taking any drugs of any kind, whether legal, prescribed or illegal. But the capacity of humans to see things is impaired in many ways. I mean, quite often one comes across cases of elderly people who see the most remarkable things, and in fact turns out their medication just needs a bit of attention. Once they change the dosage on the medication they're taking, the apparitions stop. Linked with this, of course, is physical disability or illness. That can sometimes, I'm thinking here particularly of a optical condition called Charles Bonnet syndrome, which seems to affect the optical nerves, the nerve system, makes people see little figures. It's been documented since the 18th century. It may explain some of the stories of the weirder stories of sightings of fairies and gnomes and elves and so forth. And it's actually a symptom of optical disturbance in the optic nerves. And then, of course, you mustn't rule out the nod to the sociologists and social scientists. You can have duress and social pressure. People feel pressed into telling a story. This is one that folklorists recognise. People will tell you they've seen the ghost because they want to please you, to make your efforts in investigating seem worthwhile. Sometimes feel pressurised into going along with the stories of other people. And then more difficult areas, you can look at antisocial or borderline personality disorders. This is where we're moving in more into the psychiatric side. There can be delirium. People suffer as a result of some kind of illness or incident, during hospitalisation. They may be on medication and see things. Then there's out and out psychotic disorders. All kinds of things to do with dissociation, with dreaming, borderline states of between waking and sleeping can produce all kinds of seemingly apparitional experiences. It's a criticism I could advance about my own experience, leaving aside the coincidence. When you look at best part of a century or more's record of apparitional sightings, about a third of people see their apparition when they're in bed. Were they in the process of going to sleep or waking up? Is it something about that state of consciousness that makes one more open? It would certainly help explain why we haven't got any decent ghost photographs. People experience dreams, but nobody's yet managed to photograph a dream. And when one thinks of the marvellous pageantry your unconscious mind can produce every night, if it's given a chance in dreams, well, there could be a link between apparitional experiences and dreaming. And then, of course, it might be your fault that they're seeing a ghost. What are known as iatrogenic diseases. They're actually created by the investigator who so pressurizes or intimidates the witness that they start coming out with stories, or you give them so much information they start suffering from suggestion. So you are the cause of it. And that, I'm afraid, does happen. Certainly with more irresponsible ghost hunters. They go in, they persuade some hapless family who may or may not have experienced something genuinely paranormal, and persuade them that their house is infested by demons. That was a case I visited in Peterborough at the end of 2013. There was a young woman with 2 children, one disabled, and she was living with also with a half-brother was there. They had had a succession of psychic investigators, mediums, spiritualists, clairvoyants, magical elemental conjurers, all trooping to the house and giving them the most fantastic tales, which had actually just scared them. And they were, particularly the brother was getting frightened of his own shadow. They produced indeed a remarkable recording of what they said was a demon laughing in the loft, and I listened to this, which they wouldn't go up to. And the demon laughing in the loft, well, it certainly sounded a gruff sort of voice, but playing the 2-minute tape in which it went it was for 6-second intervals, about 20 seconds apart, and it was possible to diagnose that actually as a plumbing fault, to do with the cistern of the toilet and the system they had. When they fixed the plumbing, the demonic laughter stopped in the loft. But they had been, they had been scared as much as anything into it. And then finally, you have to make sure you take perhaps a skeptical eye to investigators who've preceded you. Their records may contain errors and falsehoods about sightings and things that never happened. If you want an absolute classic of this, though relatively few people in psychical research have ever taken it seriously, but it has wasted the time of a lot of would-be ghost hunters for many, many years, and it has been taken without proper investigation and repeated as a source book for a lot of authors of popular ghost books. There's a most mischievous book written in 1931 called Ghosts of the Broads by Dr. Charles Sampson, who was a Harley Street medic. How could you not trust a medic? You can trust me, I'm a doctor, for heaven's sake. Well, he wrote an incredible book of ghosts and hauntings, which he maintained could be witnessed quite regularly, quite almost periodically, some places on the Broads and rivers in Norfolk and Suffolk. And these aren't just any old ghosts, you know, these aren't sort of shadowy grey ladies or phantom footsteps. These are whole scale, almost Versailles type creations of scenery, what you might call phantom pageantry. He seems very keen on phantom ships. He talks about Viking longboats full of ghosts being seen, and Dark Age warriors. He has whole processions of Roman soldiers, not your Harry Martindale 12 figures trooping through a cellar. No, whole scale colosseums being recreated at Wroxham Broad. And he also seems to have a fascination with skeletons. Most apparitions that are reported either look like vague shapes or they look like human beings. Well, these are glowing, malevolent skeletons, and there's even some manifestations from the devil as well, popping up at various points. Now, you know, this book was published probably tongue-in-cheek 1931. It was then republished without sufficient critical comment in 1973. And it's carried on being a local bestseller ever since, and a great many people seem to have gone along with its stories. The whole book is a complete work of fiction. Only one of the apparitions, possibly two, have any basis even in local folklore. So you can't always trust an investigator when they tell you there's a ghost. So what can we do? Well, what we can do is go back to the large amounts of witness testimony we do have, and just working on the assumption that some of this must have validity, just simply on the law of large numbers, that most people surveyed over the years, most people are probably telling you a genuine experience. You know, applying the provisos I've explained, well, we do have an awful lot of witness testimony. And we can look at that witness testimony in terms of not just simply what they tell us about the ghost, but also, I think, about the way in which the experience is described. Because it's not just a question of looking at how they describe a ghost. That perhaps it's maybe one of the problems for investigators. We look at accounts of ghost sightings, and all the emphasis is on the apparition, what they see. Now, you know, and they see a man, they see a woman, they see a figure in First World War costume or whatever, a soldier of First World War, a lady in some flowing white dress, this kind of thing. You'll find endless amounts of testimony like this. A lot of it, been published once, no one's ever gone back to it. Or you may get these remarkable animal apparitions here, some of the more extraordinary ones, black dogs with glowing eyes like coals of fire. People do seem to still report them from the evidence that's gone on. Now, if you try and make sense of these sightings, well, you'll be there forever. In the end, it's a bit like trying to make sense of UFO phenomena. There are just so many sightings and so many things. You can study it for 20, 30 years and you'll still be no wiser if you try and just study the apparition. But maybe what we could learn from is if we study the actual modes of perception, the actual way in which people talk about their experience, and the things that they are telling us apart from the sighting of the ghost. Things like, give you my favourite example, the time of day. The time of day when people see an apparition. Now, when you've heard hundreds and hundreds of stories like I have over many years, you realise something in the Western world. You realise nobody sees a ghost at breakfast. None of the stories ever begin, I was eating my cornflakes when I saw. But as you go through the day, you plot the frequency of the sightings. Where there is evidence of when it was seen, you find that the frequency of sighting goes up, reaching a peak at the traditional witching hour of midnight through till dawn. For example, my experience was about 5 o'clock in the morning. And you'll find, if you plot them on a graph, you'll find that the bulk of sightings occur later during the day, into the evening, into the night. Maybe again, there's this link here with dreaming. What this can tell us, or we might be able to infer from this, is that there is something about seeing a ghost which links up with brain chemistry at night. Now, whatever is going on in the experience, it seems to be more commonplace during the hours of darkness. That's long-standing and traditional, and what ghost hunters spend their time running around in the dark. But that is also telling us, I think, something about the actual consciousness, the elements of consciousness going on. Another thing you'll see reported many times, I mean, it's been recognised separately in ufology, but also occurs in certainly citing more of the bizarre sightings of things like black dogs. It's a disturbed sense of time, or sometimes before quite a dramatic psychic experience, sort of time slips, you might term them, you'll have the witness saying something like, well, the birds seem to go quiet. There was a sense of everything becoming still. Time seems to slow down. Again, something is going on with perception at that point, and it is that point that the anomaly is experienced. But more widely, something is actually happening to their perceptual nature, what might be called the phenomenology of the experience. It's the structure of consciousness is altering. Now, you might quite simply say, well, that's the end of that, then it's all hallucinations, all going on inside their own head, except that's not the simple answer, because first of all, you have the collective cases, you have more than one witness at the same time reporting things. Secondly, you get the successive cases where consecutive witnesses, different times at the same location, experience broadly the same sort of thing. And so it can't just simply be that this is all just a dream. If it is a dream, it's one which is more collective. You might almost call it a public hallucination, but it occurs sometimes along with perceptual disturbances, reports of lights, flashes, even physical anomalies. Think of how many haunted houses, if you've done investigation for any number of years, where they talk to you about electrical anomalies, the lights switching on and off, the TV switching on by itself or switching off, breakdown of equipment. I mean, if we're taking equipment on a ghost hunt, most people with any experience know the only thing you can say about equipment is seems to be more prone to break down in these locations than it is to function properly. Now, maybe that is the clue that we can get from deploying equipment. Something else you notice is that when people have strange experiences, what you might talk about as archaic forms of thinking come back to them. They start to think maybe on what we might say was a more primitive or indigenous or archaic or ancient way of thinking. when people have strange experiences, thinking which is not generally in accord with the 20th or 21st century. People start to think about spells or witchcraft or really something quite menacing or dangerous going on. They start to think about their own models of reality in these experiences. Suddenly their own ability to judge reality is being challenged and tested. And there may be a change of emotional significance. I mean, generally people believe that if they see a ghost, they will get scared. Well, I didn't feel scared when I saw one. It was a completely different emotional experience for me. It was one of sadness and depression. Um, I perhaps at the back of my mind, I kind of guessed with the apparition I saw, a crisis apparition, that was what it could mean. It could mean that this lady had actually died at that point or was in the process of dying. Now, that didn't consciously really go through my mind when I saw it. What I did have was this overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression. I wasn't rationalizing that in terms of why am I feeling sad. That was what the experience conveyed to me. And so quite often the emotional aspect that a witness brings to it could be very important. We know that emotional events, births, deaths, illnesses, accidents, sudden shocks, sometimes celebrations, and Christmas all seem to be good times for ghosts. Traditionally, these are quite often it's dramatic life events, things happening which involve emotion and feeling. Now, in terms of when it comes to emotion and feeling, well, I'm afraid we don't have technical equipment really to judge that. It's difficult enough even for psychologists, but we don't have emotion detectors in that sense. It takes us into a whole qualitative aspect which you can only work out. And also people, talk about life changes after their experience, most common with a near-death experience, but they may suddenly have a loss of control, a feeling that their life is out of control when they see an object flying across the room with no obvious explanation. Or maybe there's some meaning to the significance. Quite often poltergeist type activity may include moments of stress at the time, and mapping the stresses at the same time I think is just as important as trying to record the experience. And the thing is, we have got no shortage of this kind of material to study. There are truckfuls of it. ASSAP's been collecting it for nearly 40 years. Ghost Club's got records going back to the 19th century. The SBR has got shelves and shelves in Cambridge University Library, and the Alistair Hardy Institute over at Lampeter University's got something like 7,000 personal testimonies of letters collected by them since the institute was founded back in the early 1960s, and practically hundreds of books on the subject, all filled with information. And from your own experiences going out talking to your friends, neighbours, family members, probably about 1 in 3 will come up with some kind of experience. So there's no problem finding this material, but it's a way of looking at it, and analysing it afresh, which I think is possible. So it is that's hence the title, Back to the Future. Now, conscious of time rolling on, and I've talked for perhaps a bit too long, and do feel free to edit this tape, but finally I would just take you back. I think there is one very good opportunity we all get in our lifetimes to see an apparition, and there's growing amounts of evidence for this, and you could probably collect, if you talk to the right people, examples of it. The only downside is that, and it has not been studied in great detail, but studies are coming along in different places. Your good window of opportunity once in a lifetime is actually when you're dying, because there is an awful lot of testimony of people in their last few weeks, days, and hours seeing one or more apparitions. Apparitions reported by the dying. Talk to doctors, talk to nurses who are with people who are passing from this life in their last days, hours, and so on. Talk to hospice workers, and it's quite remarkable how people who when their time to die approaches report seeing an apparition. And there's a study being done at a hospice, Buffalo, New York, of many hundreds of cases like this have been being collected, and these experiences can't be ascribed simply, the medical view is, just to delirium, hallucination, medication, and so forth. Quite often these experiences are structured, the apparitions are recognized, they're of deceased family members or friends. Quite often they have significance to the person in terms of resolving an issue from earlier in their lives. There is something going on in those last few days or hours which leads people to have experiences. It's almost, I mean, the near-death experience is a separate one. People go off, have an experience. It's a bit of a puzzle how any of this happens, because the whole brain, normal terms, in our everyday consciousness, is not understood. So what happens in extreme situations, we are still only feeling our way. But it does seem that that is the one point where a great many people will actually see an apparition. So the good news is, yes, we could all be on course to see one or more apparitions in our life. The bad time is that you may not have very long to tell anyone about it, because you will go on to find out one way or the other, or not, as the case may be. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I've talked for a rather long time, but I hope some of this will be of interest, will stimulate thought, and good luck. My sincere good wishes to each and every one of you. Thank you very much indeed.